to Tiki Tuesday Talks again. We're packing them in week by week this summer. We got some amazing minds here. So we're super excited to welcome Wayne Curtis. Wayne, what's going on? Tell us where you are, what's happening.
I am in Grand Lake Stream, Maine, on the Canadian border, about 4 hours northeast of Portland. And so just saying, it was in the 50s all weekend. I had the heat going. It's summer doesn't feel like it's arrived. It's now in the 70s. So it's quite pleasant today. I'll take it.
Got it. Well,
better. You don't want to talk about tiki when it's 52.
No. Actually, it's funny you bring that up. There's been a couple waves of Tiki by the Sea where we just hit this perfect storm in Wildwood, which can be variable in weather. And it was like into like the low 50s with sideways rain, people wrapped up in their like blankets they brought down from the room. And the photographer's like, how do you want me to make this look fun and tiki? It's just really no way to do it. But yeah, great to have you. Sounds like a nice vantage point up there at the end of the country. Steva, what's happening? New background?
Yes, I'm in Austin this week, Austin, Texas, to see some friends and eat a very fancy dinner tonight that I'm very excited about.
Oh, all right. That's cool.
Yeah, I'm actually sitting in a pool house at my friend's condo, and I would show you the pool, but then I would have to be in the pool, so that's why you can't see the pool.
That would be very tiki-ish. So.
That would, yeah, live from the pool.
Yeah, just taking calls from the pool, no big deal.
You can do one of these from a pool. I'm gonna make it happen. Aaron, you're 10 years younger.
Yeah, I had to step through the fountain of youth real quick and then gain my 2014 demeanor back. So yes,
right, good.
That, and I had a barber that was long lost, and I finally found him. So
there you go. Excellent. All right, well, we're gonna see you guys in a little bit. Let's jump into this. So the usual for you guys have joined us again. Wayne Curtis, author and rum aficionado, is going to be talking rums of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, presented by Appleton. As usual, chat box and questions. If you have them, hit us up via Facebook, Zabby, etc. Please do share the event. Presentation 30 to 40 minutes, cocktail session thereafter, and we'll have 5 questions with the Tiki fam. So Wayne, author of And a Bottle of Rum, A History of the New World in 10 Cocktails, published in 2006, updated in 2018. Frequent writer about cocktail, spirits, travel, and history for many publications, and was the spirits and cocktail columnist for the Atlantic magazine for 8 years. Currently a drink columnist for the Daily Beast, Imbibe, and Garden and Gun. He was named Best Cocktail and Spirits Writer in 2017 at Tales of the Cocktail. Currently teaches at the graduate writing program of Johns Hopkins. Lives in NOLA and Maine currently. Great to have you, sir.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite. I'm glad to be here and talk about my favorite subject.
There you go. So let's transition over to your deck. Oh, there it is. Boom. Look at that. Seamless.
Technology. It's a wonderful thing.
Technology. All right. I'm handing it off to you. Let's take it away, please.
Okay, great. Well, again, thanks for those who've tuned in. I'm glad you're here. Glad you've taken some time this afternoon to come listen to me talk about rum. I know it'll come as a surprise that that's what I'm talking about. Specifically when we talk about the type of rum people were drinking from the 20s, so during Prohibition, right up through the 50s, the Mad Men era, and how it evolved over the course of that time. Those of you who do know me know that I when I write about cocktails and spirits, what I really like to do is explore the borderlands between history, pop culture, and liquor, where they all bump into one another and find out what's been happening, what people were drinking, what it tells us about the culture. So I've sort of a professional fascination by what people were drinking in each of the eras of the past, and what forces that helped shape what they were drinking. So when I was researching my book, I spent a lot of time thinking about colonial era rums and rums of the 19th century. That history involved a lot of research, figuring out what rums tasted like, And that took a lot of imagination because I wasn't able to source a whole lot of rums from the 18th and 19th century. In fact, none. I might have had a sip of one late 19th century rum, but was not very successful on that. So a lot of it was reverse engineering, reading distilling manuals and accounts of the time and trying to figure out rum tasted like. When I got into the 20th century, though, and writing about some of the rums more recently over the last century, I got a little bit luckier, was able to taste some of those rums. A lot of that was thanks to this guy, Stephen Remsburg. Some of you may know of. He is a resident of New Orleans, retired attorney. He's been collecting rum for 30, 40 years. He's just been obsessed with it. When I first ran into him in the early aughts, he had somewhere around 800 bottles in his collection. Some of that, I think he did have a couple from the late 19th century. We tasted a lot from Prohibition era rums and others, so got a chance to sample that and learn a little bit more about those kind of rums. So I wanted to give him a shout out. He's been very helpful all along. He recently sold his collection. I think it was last summer. So it's sad for New Orleans, sad for me, but good news for Stephen and his family. He did just fine with it.
I'm sure.
So
that's quite a collection, right?
Yeah,
there, I could see
that. And this is his pre-Katrina collection. I was there before Katrina. The house flooded badly. He got about 6 feet of water. A lot of the bottles lost their labels, so he wasn't able to really track them down. But he had enough stashed away up high. He said he had a premonition when Katrina was rolling in. He put a lot. You see the picture on the left. A lot of them go right down to the floor. He took a lot of those and moved them up onto the kitchen counter, and the water came right up to the kitchen counter. It didn't.
Wow.
But the fact that it sat in the house for 2 weeks with 100-degree temperatures and all that water in there, humidity, the labels just slid off a lot of the bottles. So some of them were lost. Any event, we could do a whole hour. We should get Stephen to talk at some point. But we'll move on. We're going to talk, like I said, about rums from the 20s through the 50s. If I had to describe those rums in one word, it would be transitional. It was a transitional time. Rum was on its way from being one thing en route to being another. If you gave me a few more words, I would summarize it as being the second disappearance of rum, which hopefully I'll be able to explain over the course of the next half hour or so. Before we begin, I would like to take a few moments to pay a tribute to some of the lost rums, those that left us before their time. Well, some of them that left before their time, some should have left. Anyway, if you please take off your hats. Okay.
Good prices there. Good prices.
If you give me a moment to compose myself. So sad. So many rums. So many
rums.
Yeah. So we'll push on. This talk's really going to be a view from about 30,000 feet. I'm not going to dive down and zero in on many of the specific rums that have come and gone, but more talk about some of the things that influence rums overall and sort of at a macro level, what we were drinking in the U.S. So, what I wanted to look at was if there's anything going on between the 1920s and the 1950s, and if so, how those things affected rum. It turns out a lot was going on in the 1920s to the 1950s, and it turned out everything that happened was affecting what we drink. And we'll start off by looking at the four main influences on the era. There's the four horsemen of the rum-pocalypse. There's Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, and then, of course, the great scourge of vodka.
The scariest of all those, potentially.
No comment. They're all equally scary. Although my experience has only been with vodka, and I find that terrifying. We're going to start off with Prohibition, or the banning of the sale and transport of liquor from 1919 to 1933. It had a predictably horrendous impact on spirits all across the U.S. No surprise there. The number of distilleries plummeted from thousands across the U.S. to as close to you can get to absolute zero when it comes to alcohol. They were just all shuttered and shut down. The industry never really even rebounded, even after repeal. Especially hit the domestic whiskey industry really hard, because that was a lot of what was being made in the U.S. And then there was rum. And as for rum, Prohibition was without doubt the best thing that happened to rum in more than a century. Let's not forget, but rum in 1920, when Prohibition kicked in, was actually pretty obscure. What was available in the U.S. Was not that good. Rum's heyday was really from 1690 to about 1790, after which domestic whiskey really came to dominate the U.S. market and really took over in most homes. Rum faded. It still came into the ports along the eastern seaboard, but it tended to be the stuff that was in the back of the closet at your aunt's house, and they pulled it out when they needed it for a pie, or somebody had a cough or a sore throat. It was it had some stank to it, and it was really associated with a bygone era. Rum was something that was sort of from the earlier times. Here's a newspaper story from 1902 that pondered the fate of rum and its disappearance as a all-American tipple. It says, many a sensible old fellow who enjoys life will tell you that a Santa Cruz sour is the finest of all summer drinks, but he is apt to add with a sigh, but where are you going to find any genuine old Santa Cruz rum nowadays? The article goes on to say, the disappearance of rum from the general market is one of the curiosities of drinking. Half a century ago, it was a standard tipple. Its admirers will tell you that it has every quality to endear itself to man. Old rum drinkers will put themselves in evidence to prove that it is a wholesome drink when used with discretion. So it has faded out. Here's I love this ad. It's from 1902 for Old Colony rum, another disappeared rum. Would you call this an overhyped sales pitch? Here's the entirety. We think we need to say no more about Old Colony that is an absolutely pure rum. If that's the kind of rum you want, buy Old Colony. Copywriters at the time were a little bit different. They were not really hyping up rum at the time, but You want rum? If you drink rum, we got rum.
Sorry, Wayne, to interrupt. Santa Cruz sour. Tell us about that.
It would have just been Virgin Islands rum, from St. Croix, and it would just been a traditional sour, just made with sugar and lime shaken up, basically a daiquiri. Yeah. But this Santa, well, I didn't want to get into the weeds any. Santa Cruz. All right. Back to you. We'll circle back around to Virgin Island rum in a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about another brand that came out at the time. So anyway, rum basically had one foot in the grave when Prohibition came in. It was not really that common. And then Prohibition stepped in to change all that. Yeah. So the popular spirits that people were drinking at the time, rye and bourbon and other whiskeys, were obviously, they just disappeared for the most part when the distillery shut down. And it became much harder to source what people like to drink. So rum stepped in and heroically filled the gap. And it did this in two ways. First off, rum distillers on the islands sort of stepped up their game. Rum had diminished in popularity. There were still distilleries operating on the islands, but they were mostly catering to the local market as well as to the occasional tourist who came through on boat. But with Prohibition, a whole new market opened up for them, a whole new opportunity. They could sell to these fleets of boats that sailed in the dark of night from the islands, particularly the Bahamas and Cuba, into the mangrove swamps of Florida and up the bayous of Louisiana. We always hear about smuggling off the tip of Long Island with the boats connecting off the 12-mile limit at the outset. And then we hear a lot about the Detroit traffic and Canadian whiskey, other Canadian smuggled goods at the time. But there was an equally vibrant trade in the South as well. And much of what came in through the mangrove swamps was rum. thousands of cases made their way from the Bahamas to South Florida. There's one smuggler, notable smuggler named Red Shannon, who used to run quite a bit. He was killed in a shootout outside the Flamingo Hotel in Miami, over on the left. You hear a lot about the stuff that's going on in Chicago and New York, Boston, but you don't hear that much about Florida. But there was stuff going on there too. The guy on the right is James Horace Alderman. He was probably the most successful, most prolific smuggler in Florida right up until 1926. Coast Guard intercepted his boat. They arrested him. He and his men got on the Coast Guard boat. There was a gunfight. 3 of the Coast Guard sailors were killed. He was tried and convicted to hang. He was the first and only person to be hung by the Coast Guard. I don't know. Put this on my list of things to investigate. I don't know if he's the only person to be hung for violating prohibition either, but when I get some time, I start do a little bit more digging into this. So anyway, rum from all over the West Indies started making its way into the U.S. Through the smuggling channels to help slake thirst during Prohibition. Who knows what happened to that rum once it got here? Likely it was cut with some industrial alcohol or some other illegally produced ethanols that to sort of cut it and be able to stretch supplies. So it's unclear what the flavor profile was of those rums that people were drinking at the time in the U.S. But we do have a better sense of the rum that arose for the second reason that Prohibition helped rum, and that was that not the rum coming in, but the drinkers going out. The travel just boomed to places where you could get legal liquor. And for much of the country, that was the West Indies, and in particular Cuba, which sort of has been considered the 48th state at the time in the pre-Hawaii and pre-Alaska era. Sort of new transportation networks grew up to supply, to get people down to Florida. The first internationally scheduled airline flight was Pan American Airways, which flew from Key West down to Cuba. There were also flights from Miami. There were men with sandwich boards walking up and down the streets of Miami that said, "Bathe in Bacardi tonight." You could book a ticket, fly off, be there in an hour or two, and on the streets and drinking. So the visitors sort of just really flooded into Havana. The bar scene was great. A lot of it was familiar. Many of the bartenders who had been doing good business in the U.S. relocated down to Cuba. There was a man from Newark, New Jersey, a bartender who just took a crowbar to his bar, hauled the whole thing out, put it on a boat, sailed it to Cuba, reinstalled it in a bar in Havana, and got back in business down there. So those that showed up down there, what they found when they arrived in Cuba was, they didn't find a lot of whiskey. They didn't find a lot of scotch. Could find some. But what they mostly found was rum. And what they discovered, it was not that stinky medicinal rum under their aunt's stairway. It was clean and light and bright and quite crisp and tasty. And that was thanks to Bacardi, which was established in 1862. And for 50 years had been quietly ramping up its skills with liquor production, rum production. It was paying closer attention to distillation. It was paying closer attention to barrel aging, and it was starting to use filtration, mostly charcoal and presumably sand in their proprietary filtration methods, in order to bring something out that was much unexpected to the American drinking tourist. This is a quote from 1928 from Basil Woon, who wrote a book called When It's Cocktail Time in Cuba. And why aren't people named Basil Woon anymore, I ask you? Beginning as a thick, dark brown drink to make pirates drunk, and passing through its phase as a universal medicine, rum, by the grace of a family named Bacardi and of American Prohibition, had become, in fact, a gentleman's drink. So Bacardi really seized the moment when the tourists started flooding in and there was demand for rum abroad. They were based in Santiago de Cuba. They moved their headquarters up to Havana. This was their headquarters. They had a couple of Cuban architects design it, but they brought in a noted American illustrator named Maxfield Parrish. You probably recognize this widely copied painting that he did. He was, did this hyper stylized romantic paintings, and they brought him in to try to add some touches to it. What they also did was add a bar on the second floor mezzanine. So when you walked in, you could go up to the second floor and there's a bar there. And they had touts greet the cruise ships when they came in and hand them invitations to come up to the Bacardi bar and have a free drink on them to introduce them to the new Bacardi flavor. So people showed up. They were surprised by this rum and they really enjoyed it. Another one was Havana Club, had the headquarters a few blocks down on another plaza, and they did the same thing. You could go in and get a free drink there. So it's basically the Prohibition was a huge marketing effort for this lighter, brighter, crisper type of rum. And they people brought it back. Bacardi doesn't miss a beat. They started advertising. You could bring it back, and I've seen accounts where you could go
advertising that
at cruise ship terminals. You could buy little things to smuggle rum back, including that I've seen pictures of these holsters that you would just wear as a belt, and they had little slots in them, and you could put minis in them. So you could put a couple dozen minis around your waist and put your jacket over it and walk through customs when you got back with that. So
sounds like some good brand POS there. Somebody needs to start working on.
That would be great. See, they should start hanging that out. Appleton, are you paying attention?
Hey, Wayne, real quick question while we're in this area.
Yep.
What type of wood were the early rum distilleries using for their barrels? So I guess that probably is less related to this piece, the Bacardi component, but before that.
Anything they could get is basically what it was. I mean, barrels were so commonplace. It was just amazing. Barrels were shipped for everything. The U.S. Mint used barrels to ship coins and bills in. You could ship, pickles and fish and nails and hardware, and everything went in barrels. They were basically the cardboard box of the era. And so anything that was could be had was had. That's the lore is, and I'm not sure that anybody's nailed it down, is that the insides of barrels were charred to get the flavor of what was in there previously. It might have been dried cod in there. You don't want that with your rum, so you char the inside of the barrel to get the flavor out. And then they realized that the char actually has a purpose. It serves as a filtration. It helps neutralize some of the noxious elements in liquor. So it took off. But whatever was available, which is probably mostly white oak, because white oak is one of the few easily accessible woods that is watertight because of the way the tyloses run, the pores. Again, another 1 hour seminar, we could talk about barrel structure. Let's say they were white oak that contained other things, is what my presumption would be.
Got it.
Wood that was being used.
Right.
So the Prohibition was a great thing for rum. People discovered it was lighter and brighter. They brought it back. They told their neighbors, their friends, their family. Rum sort of was on its way back in the 1920s, which brings us to the end of the 1920s, October 1929. The Great Depression kicks off, and then pretty much occupied the whole of the 1930s. 1 out of 3 banks failed during the Depression. Unemployment rate reached around 25%. This obviously had an impact on all industries across America. Demand was down, cash was non-existent. They started shuttering. It just became a domino effect. One industry it really didn't impact was distilling, because distilling didn't exist in 1929. We still had 3 more years of Prohibition to go. But what was helped by Prohibition was distilling, because there was a real push to get people back to work in that time. And then a lot of politicians, there are a number of reasons why Prohibition was repealed, partly also because it turned everybody into a criminal. Prior to Prohibition, no one really broke the law, but during Prohibition, a lot of people broke the law. It's sort of equivalent to the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit that was imposed in the 1980s. Suddenly everyone was a lawbreaker. And so that started to fray the social contract. That was part of it. But a lot of it was that wanting to put people back to work, wanting to get industries going again, and distillation was ready to go. So that helped put things all together. Just, a parade float, give us beer, balance the budget was happening. So repeal comes in 1933 to allow distillation to start back up again. And like I said, prior to Prohibition, rum wasn't really that existent, but post-Prohibition, we start seeing some changes in the American taste. This was a survey some enterprising reporter did in 1936, 3 years after repeal. He surveyed the 2,000 members of the Intellectual Town Hall Club in New York City and asked them what did they drink. What they liked was a nice steak and rum cocktails, which I thought was interesting, that this is sort of the elite was now drinking rum in 1936, which I don't think you would have found evidence for prior to that. But the Depression had even more direct impact on rum, or rather the efforts to recover from the Depression had an impact on rum, because the economic downturn didn't just affect the mainland United States. It also badly hit the territories with the islands, particularly Puerto Rico, as well as the American Virgin Islands. which the U.S. acquired from Denmark in 1917. Those islands and all the islands were really hammered by the Depression as well. And on the Virgin Islands, about 60% of the islanders were eligible for welfare of some sort in the early 1930s. So the government channeled, under New Deal programs and others, government channeled a lot of money into the islands. $2.5 million went to the Virgin Islands to invest in sugarcane fields and a rum distillery after Prohibition was repealed. That's right. The federal government that banned liquor started making it. And the same administration under FDR who signed repeal and also signed the act to create this rum distillery. The feds took quite an interest in the rum distillery that they were building. By feds, FDR was interested in that. The names they considered for this new government rum, one was peg leg rum, which FDR did not like and sort of vetoed. Another one was colonial rum, which seemed a little on the nose, but they skipped over that and they ended up calling it government house rum.
Great name.
So FDR was so involved with this project that he contributed a sketch for the label, which had sort of a fortress and palm trees and a sailing ship in the background. So not surprisingly, government involvement in making and marketing rum did not go over very well among the anti-liquor crowd, nor did it go over very well among the distilling crowd, the whiskey distillers in the U.S. who were still trying to get back on their feet after both Prohibition and the Great Depression. It seems to me like it was really rubbing salt in the wounds. On the back of the label of Government House Rum, it had this line was printed. It said, "You can use this rum successfully in place of whiskey in any recipe." So it's sort of striking that the U.S. government could be that involved in the rum trade.
I knew about that.
This part, this is probably going to be mostly of interest to rum geeks, but the Government House Rum was not made from molasses. It was made from sugarcane juice. And it even boasted that no molasses was used in the production of Government House Rum. What it doesn't say, though, is whether it was fresh sugarcane juice, like the agricole style from some French islands, or sugarcane juice that had been boiled down into a syrup, like is used at Barbancourt in Haiti today or forever. I'm assuming that the Government House Rum was from boiled down sugarcane syrup or cane honey, because I don't think anyone would liken a agricole style rum to a whiskey and say it could be a replacement for it in any cocktail. And I've read other accounts that nobody really liked the rum made from fresh sugarcane juice that made it into the U.S. at the time. I found one 1937 account that said that that rum was just strange to Americans. It said, quote, "The public in general does not like rum made with cane juice because it has a certain oversweet flavor that is not very agreeable." The account went on to say better was the rum from sugarcane syrup that had been boiled down. They said that was, quote, "more popular in all markets because it wasn't too sweet." In any case, Government House Rum came out. 50,000 cases arrived in April 1937, and apparently it sold pretty well. There was a lot of demand for it, and but not to last till today. So we can add that to the in memoriam list. And I've never tasted any. I don't know if anybody listening has ever tracked down a bottle of Government House Rum, but imagine there's one out there somewhere. I would love to try that out at some point.
Yeah.
So that's Virgin Islands. Meanwhile, over in Puerto Rico, the government was also involved in the rum industry, although less directly than they were on the Virgin Islands. The general belief among the policymakers at the time was that Puerto Rico's economic hardships were largely due to the fact it was just too agricultural. It's too dependent on farming. So a lot of the money, investment money that went into Puerto Rico went into the industrial sector. And one major beneficiary of that was the rum industry. And that helped prod other investments in there. There's a Florida distiller that had opened after Prohibition that merged with an island distiller that created Ron Rico rum, which still exists today. That was that Ron Rico was really the king of rums before Bacardi set up shop on the island in 1936. Money flowed into the research for rum industries. The U.S. government wanted to help that, the Puerto Rican government as well, including at the famed agricultural research station in Mayagüey in Puerto Rico, and that employed Rafael Arroyo, a scientist who spent a lot of his time in the lab learning how to make rum better and lighter and more consistent. Puerto Rico had always been famous for its lighter style rums, but this really even took it to the next level, eliminating a lot of the congeners and making it even less molasses quality to it. So the research really helped further that trend. And above all, both for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, they were really helped by their tax status as U.S. territories. They could export to the U.S. without paying those duties that other islands had to pay, like Trinidad, Jamaica, and Cuba. And this gave distillers a real advantage in the U.S. markets. Foremost among realizing this was Bacardi, which I mentioned, set up in 1936. People commonly say, Bacardi left Cuba because of Castro, but they were actually out well ahead of Castro. They did not like Batista, who was his predecessor, and they started moving their assets and their production over to Puerto Rico well before Castro showed up with his boys and his cigars. So the upshot of Great Depression, again, it emphasized the lighter rums. It helped the lighter rums of Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, less light than Puerto Rico, but still pretty light. It really gave them a boost and expanded their reach in the American market. Which brings us to the third horseman of the rum apocalypse, World War II. I mean, war probably does more than anything else to change society's tastes. You can see this time and again from the 17th century when the British invaded Holland and came back with a taste for gin and created the British gin industry. Also, World War II, you had a lot of soldiers over in France discovered that red wine or any wine was quite tasty, and they brought back a taste for that. And a lot of soldiers went to the South Pacific, and they came back with lots of tales of the South Pacific, which, while not directly related to rum, would end up playing a pretty big influence in the whole tropical drinks trend. But I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. We'll circle back around to that. But the World War II had impacts on the liquor industry in a number of ways. Perhaps most significantly, the U.S. government in October 1942 mandated that U.S. distilleries all shutter and cease producing whatever hooch they were into, which again was mostly whiskey, and they had to start making industrial alcohol for the war effort that helped with the production of synthetic rubber and aviation fuel. The liquor industry felt a little bit put out by this and felt they had to take out ads explaining the shortages so that consumers wouldn't hate them so much. And at the same time, the U.S. production was off. The exports coming in from, or the imports coming in from Europe were sharply curtailed. The Scotch from Scotland, whiskey from Ireland, brandy from France, just because of the requisition of cargo ships, as well as the threat of German subs and torpedoes sinking them. So liquor supplies, once again, just like Prohibition, got tight. And who stepped into the breach to fill the gap? Well, you can probably guess it was the West Indian rum industry. So when Prohibition was repealed, a lot of the rum that had been distilled for the smugglers market and the tourist market got set aside. The distilleries were mothballed as the whiskey was again available commonly. The American drinker shifted back to what they were more familiar with, and there was just the rum distilleries were there, but rum was not being made. So, rum really just did not have that monopoly on the market that it had during Prohibition. But during World War II, the distilleries came back. They dusted off, cleaned out, and started producing again, and started cranking up production. And so rum started flowing again north, and the casks started coming into the ports and the bottles. And rum just really began flooding back into the American market during the war to help with that. In fact, there was so much supply of rum that it outstripped demand in a lot of ways. During World War II, it was common for liquor salesmen to offer up a case of scotch to a bar, but the whispered catch was that they also had to order a case of rum, or 2 cases, or 5 cases of rum to go along with the 1 case of scotch that they were able to get a hold of. These were called tie-ins. They were illegal, also common as hell, and none of them were ever prosecuted.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. I won't name any names, but yeah, that was the thing. So during the war, rum imports from Puerto Rico, Barbados, and Trinidad increased 5-fold, and the Jamaican There was Jamaican rum. Most of it, interesting, most of Jamaican rum went to Germany before the war. The Germans used it to flavor their distillate from sugar beets, which they called rum at the time. Of course, that market collapsed when the war broke out, so Jamaica shifted to exporting to U.S. and Canada, but it was never in great demand here. The U.S. took as much as Holland did during the war, and the U.K. accepted 5 times more rum from Jamaica than the U.S. did. So there was some Jamaican rum coming in, but it wasn't. But we ended up, because of the tie-ins, we ended up with drinks like the Hurricane in New Orleans, probably the most famous. Looks like it dates to about 1941 during the war, and it calls for 4 ounces of rum in every glass. So it was a way to help deplete those cases in the back and keep some of the other liquor coming through. So the war ended. Americans went back to whiskey, just like they did after Prohibition. Rum just sort of sat in the warehouses. So just after the war, the U.S. reportedly had a 5-year supply of rum just sitting and waiting to be drunk between the warehouses in the U.S. and the warehouses in the Caribbean, and no one to drink it. So you might have heard of the Bourbon Lake that formed in the 1970s when there was a large-scale shift in taste and suddenly nobody wanted bourbon and the prices dropped. This was the global rum reservoir that sort of formed after the war, and we'll come back to that for a minute. So that brings us to the 4th and final horseman of the rum apocalypse, and that would be vodka. Again, let me put some context here. Prior to World War II, vodka was essentially a footnote to the liquor trade. It was considered an exotic hooch from the steppes of Russia. It didn't even have an official import category for most of the first half of the 20th century. It was just categorized as other, along with Slivovitz and Ouzo and Grappa. But by 1949, after the war, sales of vodka were starting to rival gin, even at the time. And vodka just really blew up and never went away. It remained one of the leading spirits throughout the 20th century, right to today. Last year, 77 million cases of vodka sold, 72 million cases of whiskey. So it still remains the king of the spirit world. So when it comes to its influence on rum, vodka, both a symptom as well as a cause. So it was a symptom because vodka was really reflecting a large-scale shift of American taste buds in the post-war eras. The labor of making meals was increasingly outsourced to industrial food processors. And to make food more palatable to as many and offensive to none, a lot of the processors removed a lot of the natural flavors and replaced them with either no flavor or artificial flavors that were sort of pretty basic. As Business Week summed it up in 1952, U.S. taste buds want it bland. It was just where we were headed at the time. So vodka was perfect. Vodka was the perfect drink for a society that decided they no longer wanted any flavor, that they just wanted ease and comfort. So it was a symptom, but it was also a cause, and I think it helped change rum's flavor profile because as vodka sales took off, other spirits went chasing after it, including whiskey, which went through a white whiskey phase, and rum certainly wanted to get rid of some of the funk that was not there. The funk that was there, they wanted to get rid of. Of course, the places, the goal was just to be lighter. Here's the Smirnoff ad, filtered through a mountain of charcoal. Let's leave no flavor behind. Their slogan was, it leaves you breathless, meaning that you could have a 3-martini lunch, go back to the office, and nobody would smell booze on your breath. In retrospect, it leaves me breathless thinking that an essentially flavorless spirit could come to rule the spirits market. Rum was not immune to this chase toward neutrality, and so it naturally, who was poised to benefit most from a light, neutral rum was Puerto Rico, which not only had been making those for all the years, and it could refine them, make them even lighter, but it was also had the tax advantages that I mentioned earlier. A fifth of Don Q sold for about $4 in the U.S. in the 1950s, whereas rum from Cuba or Myers rum sold for about $6 or 50% more. And Puerto Rico also had the marketing powerhouse of Bacardi, which continued to expand as it left Cuba behind in the late 1950s. By 1952, Puerto Rico exported more rum to the U.S. than all the other West Indian producers combined. The second exporter was the Virgin Islands with about half as many cases. But by the end of the decade, by 1959, Puerto Rico was exporting about 600,000 cases to the U.S., and the Virgin Islands only had about a quarter of that going. So they even dropped off the lighter, less flavorful rums of Puerto Rico. It really came to dominate. Jamaica was being exported, but how many cases did they ship in 1959? It was 30,000 cases, or 5% of what was coming from Puerto Rico. In 1952, I thought it was interesting, Fortune magazine took a look at the range of light rums and did a little digging to find out what was going on with these popularity of these light rums and how they were made. And it noted that the sugar making and distillation process was so efficient in Cuba that it, quote, produces almost pure alcohol, so it has to be flavored synthetically. So basically, they were making neutral spirits and then making it taste like rum. On other islands, it noted that where rum production was not so efficient or ruthless, like Jamaica, the magazine noted that, quote, molasses is good and aromatic and the rum is perfectly fine. Bacardi is not rum at all. Will you have a planter's punch? This was 1952. People were harshing on Bacardi for being flavorless. But that reference to rum being synthetically flavored in rum in 1950s got my attention, so I checked in a little further, and like, here's the skinny. On Cuba, rum was, quote, reflavored lightly with sugar, wine, fruits, Baileys, and special ingredients, whatever those are. In Barbados, the rum was given flavor by placing in the still lime, soda, vegetable roots, coconut shells, and so on, quote. And on Barbados, after the rum came out of the still, it was still tweaked to give it flavor with sherry, Madeira, spirits of niter, which is basically a diuretic, bitter almonds, and raisins, which would, quoting the article, bring it to the required taste. So by 1960, rum, like most other spirits, was chasing after vodka, looking for that clean, inoffensive taste. And Puerto Rico was in a great position to capture that market. So other islands started chasing after it, with the possible exception of Jamaica. So I mentioned earlier that you can summarize this era as being the second disappearance of rum. This is what I'm suggesting. Rum was available in volume, much more than before Prohibition, but it was much less in flavor than in the 1920s. So throughout the course of the era, it just sort of was stripped down to become almost nothing. It's just sort of, rum was back, but it was sort of strangely transparent and ghostly, which brings us to a very large asterisk in this whole trend towards lightness and invisibility. So far we've talked about these four horsemen of the rumpocalypse, but there was a resistance brewing. It started in California in the 1930s and flourished in dim environments filled with varnished blowfish and thatched huts and mystery drinks heralded by gongs. And that, of course, was the Tiki resistance. I mentioned that a paltry number of cases were shipped from Jamaica to the U.S. in the 1950s, only about 5% of what was being shipped from Puerto Rico. Where was that Jamaican rum going? Apparently, a lot of it was going to the tiki bars. 1945 import figures show that Don the Beachcomber was the single biggest buyer of rum in the country. He served up some 325,000 cases at his restaurant, imported from 16 different countries. Wow. Don't know exactly how much came from Jamaica, but we can surmise from his menus that it was a fair amount. Don the Beachcomber opened in 1934 in Los Angeles. He was shortly thereafter copied by Vic Bergeron, who opened Trader Vic's in Oakland. And the two built empires and spawned a host of imitators all across the country. And in this subculture, they really rejected this light Puerto Rican style rum, the vodka style rum. They weren't chasing after vodka. They wanted the more robust flavors of more traditional, earlier rums. Was this because they loved the taste? Well, in part, sure, made for great drinks, but it's also because it was cheaper. The tiki restaurants, or the exotics or Polynesians, as they were called at the time, managed to crest at two eras of cheap, abundant, and interesting rums. I mentioned a bit earlier, the first was 1930s Post-Prohibition Era, when Americans abandoned rum, went back to whiskey, and lots of rum languished in warehouses. That was when Don and Vic got their start. And they were happy to go into these warehouses and take it off the distributors' hands at a good price. In effect, I think these two are a little bit like the importers of Mezcal and Armagnacs and Clarins today. They're like entrepreneurs who are in search of the rough, rustic, and the overlooked. The tiki had another boom in the late 1940s, post-war era, 1940s through the 1950s. So it's partly fueled by World War II, as I mentioned. Soldiers stationed in the South Pacific came back with tales of people they'd encountered and places they've seen, told their friends and families, and the whole Polynesian ideal really blossomed in the public's imagination. One of the soldiers who was stationed on the island was James Michener, who in his free time wrote a collection of stories that came out in 1947 called Tales of the South Pacific. Rodgers and Hammerstein turned that into a hit Broadway play in 1949. 10 years later, a blockbuster movie by the same name came out. It was also the opening of Disneyland in 1955 with the Jungle Cruise and the Enchanted Tiki Room. And then Elvis and Blue Hawaii, the movie, came out in 1960. So all of this Polynesian pop bubbled up. It really fueled an interest in drinks of the South Pacific, even if these drinks were wholly fabricated and had nothing to do with Polynesia or the South Pacific. And again, Vic and Don were well positioned. Remember that reference to the rum reservoir that followed World War II? In the 1950s, there was good cases of rum just sitting, waiting to be found in warehouses in the U.S. and out on islands like Jamaica. And the tiki entrepreneurs went out there and they got it. So tiki pretty much embraced the opposite of everything that the broader American public preferred. They wanted denser, funkier rums and complicated, fruitier drinks. And consider this was the Mad Men era, which was defined by the austere, near martinis, austere dry martinis that were practically invisible, both to look at as well as to taste. So tiki resistance was largely going against the tide. It sought out the brawny and the robust when most Americans were seeking out the light and the invisible. But these funky rums, even though the tiki crowd embraced them, and you could go out and find a really nicely aged Ray and Nephew or a funky and fascinating rum from Guyana and Trinidad out on the shelves, but they weren't flying off. They weren't hugely popular. Not even in the bars. Even the tiki impresarios found that the American public wasn't exactly picking up what they were putting down. Trader Vic loved Jamaican rum, but even his customers were resistant. As he wrote in 46, "It's to my sorrow that I do not find more Americans adopting this rum, for truly beautiful concoctions can be made with a heavy, pungent, and aromatic liquor." So let me start wrapping up about these eras. And looking back, if I had to single out one unifying force that shaped rum between the 1920s and the 1950s, it was this. It was this guy, actually. This guy imposed prohibition, which sent the thirsty to Cuba, where they discovered the lighter Bacardi rum and helped shape a national taste. This guy funded research in Puerto Rico to refine rum and the Virgin Islands, allowed distillers to make it ever more light. And thanks in part to this guy's tax policies, lighter Puerto Rican and Virgin Island rums came to dominate the U.S. market. And Uncle Sam, this guy, charged headlong into World War II, which shuttered the domestic distilleries, opened the door to the Caribbean rum to come flooding back into the U.S., which eventually led to a glut of rum, which allowed the tiki entrepreneurs to buy up cases of excellent, affordable rum and do wonderful things with them. So even if you look at this guy, you would have to conclude this is a guy who's never felt sand between his toes, never been to a beach, never had a drink with an umbrella in it, never so much sipped a dram of rum, and he wouldn't know a tot of good Jamaican if it bit him on the ass. He's the guy who shaped what we drink. So I'm thirsty. I suspect you're thirsty. So we're gonna make a drink. And so for the cocktail this afternoon, I thought we'd go back to the beginning of this era that I've been talking about, the 1920s, Prohibition era. And this is the Conchita, which I found in this recipe guide from Cuba. It dates to 1927. It came out during the peak of Prohibition. This drink is very simple, like a Presidente. It's very elegant, like a daiquiri. More of a classic than a tropical drink. No citrus in it. But it's something you might have sipped after stepping off the overnight steamer from Key West. And it harkens back to a time when Cuba was thriving. It was the sugar bowl of the world, producing more sugar than anybody else, about 4 million tons a year versus 3 million tons from India, the second largest producer in the world. And Cuba helped quench thirsty Americans. So let's make this. It's time and place in a glass, and we can raise a toast to our crazy Uncle Sam, who, wittingly or not, helped shape what we drank. So I've got the ingredients here. It's calls the recipe calls for equal parts dry vermouth, curacao, and rum. I suspect a lot of the drink would have at the time would have been made with some of those lighter rums that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, but I'm going to make it with the Appleton. I've used 3/4 of an ounce of each on this. So 3/4 of the Appleton, 3/4 of the Dolan, 3/4 of the Curacao. I'm using the Pierre Ferrand for this. And then a couple dashes of Angostura. Some ice in my handy thermos. Chill it down. Doesn't call for a garnish. Probably could garnish with an orange peel. I'm choosing not to. Just strain it into a coupe. And we are ready to go. So,
Nice.
here's to Uncle Sam. Cheers, everyone.
Best rum bar in the on the border of Canada and Maine. You have a
I
name
would say
for it?
so. I would say so.
Great. Very, very interesting stuff, Wayne. We did have a question here, kind of tracking back with the smugglers. Were they smuggling in barrels full, or was it bottled already?
It was bottled already. The barrels would have been too cumbersome because a lot of it meant they had to go with speed, and so that they were doing it with bottles, and they actually would typically break down the cases and package them in more easy to handle sacks. There's the great smuggling entrepot of the Northeast was Saint Pierre Miquelon, French Islands off of Newfoundland, which remained part of France. So liquor could be legally shipped there. If you go there, there's probably a dozen warehouses around the harbor, big stout concrete buildings with dates on them, 1926, 1927, because everyone would ship liquor there in crates, and then the crates would be broken up, and they would put them in burlap sacks with straw, so they could toss them from one boat to the next. And they were quiet. Once they got back onto land, you could put them in the back of a car. You could travel with them, and it wouldn't give off any noise. In fact, there is a house in Saint Pierre that's made from the interior is paneled with broken down liquor crates. I can't remember what they call it. It's a Dewar house or something like that. It's the guy, whoever lived there, just decided they would panel the inside of the house with all the broken up liquor crates. So it's pretty amazing. Anyway, no barrels. Prohibition era was post barrel, and they would have been too. They wouldn't have been handy to smuggle. Probably some certainly were, but mostly it was bottles.
Got it. Yeah, well, I mean, it's always amazing to me to see how the impact of kind of major events and / kind of political wins, and how that just has such a massive impact on the way that these industries have come up over time. Almost universally.
Oh, it's true. I think that's global, and a lot of times you don't recognize that the changes are taking place until well afterwards. I mean, it'll probably be a couple more years till we start realizing, the pandemic really affected bar culture, and here's how. Right now, it's just sort of in a fog, and realizing things don't feel the same as they used to, and we're not quite sure yet what the longer term impacts of that are going to be. But whether it's pandemics or wars or depressions or revolutions, it's going to affect what we drink.
Understood. Great. Okay, we're going to bring Jesse on. We'll be right back to you, Wayne. Don't go anywhere. Enjoy that cocktail.
I'll be right here. I'll be drinking.
All right. Jesse.
Uh-oh. He said he was ready.
I see him, but I don't see him. Hold on. Let's try and do it. I think he's frozen.
Maybe he got in the pool too.
Maybe he did. Well, let's give him a minute. Let's talk about what we got going on.
Okay. Well, we still have applications open.
There you go.
Next
Let's
week
talk
will be. You may access them on our website, tikibythesea.com.
That's correct.
They will be open till
September 12 to 14, 19 to 21. We're excited to do it in person, IRL.
It's going to be great.
It's going to be great. Jesse.
Yeah, there we go.
There he is.
Hey, how's it going?
What's happening? What do you got going on behind you?
I'm here at Montana. This is where I work. Just up here with the stills. Down below is the restaurant and bar.
Awesome.
So just here, hanging out at the distillery.
Very cool, man. Very cool. Well, let's talk about that. What's going on in your world of Colorado?
Recently moved here to Crested Butte, where Montana is at, a little over a month ago, and have been loving it. It's so beautiful out here, just in the mountains, and love being here, working with rum finally.
Yeah, man.
In like in a on site at a distillery kind of place instead of behind the bar. So it's really cool to be part of it and out here.
Awesome. All right, let's go to our 5 questions. Back to it. Favorite Tiki by the Sea memory?
Favorite Tiki by the Sea memory? Oh man, probably like, I don't know, like there's so many nice things about it. Like some of the parties we had, like I think like just that last day that we had, we were, I forget the name of the hotel we were at with the pool.
The Caribbean?
What's that?
The Caribbean?
Yeah, at the very end.
Yeah.
That was a really cool time. Like just being at the hotel and like all the vibes and like being by the pool and it was great.
Right on. Describe Wildwood to somebody. 1 sentence. Describe it.
Wildwood is a town that is completely stuck in time in a good way. That is on the ocean and is a beautiful retro paradise.
There you go. Well said. All right. Weirdest Wildwood experience.
The weirdest?
Yes.
Damn. The weirdest. Probably. Man, the only thing I can think of is like that was really kind of weird was being on the beach and running into a whole bunch of the horseshoe crabs.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if anyone's ever seen them, but they look like aliens. Like they don't look like anything else. Like,
Maybe they are.
They look like mutants for sure.
And they got blue blood, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Right on. All right, Steva, what I missed?
I think that's it. Jesse, I'm super excited about this distillery. I have a regular who's from Crested Butte, so I'll have to tell him to come see you next time he's in town.
Nice. Yeah. Have any of you all been out here? Or
I've never been there. I've been to Denver.
nice.
Pete's been to Denver a bunch of times.
Yeah. How far is it away from Denver?
It's quite a drive. It's about at least 4.5 hours of a drive.
Yeah.
It's not that far, but you just can't drive a straight line in Denver. Like you have to
Right.
go around mountains and through mountains.
Yeah.
So it's a gorgeous drive. But if you ever do come down here, but please tell your friend to come in. And I'm glad to continue being in the Rum family here. And
Awesome, man.
hope one day I can share it all with you, and y'all can come down here, or y'all can try.
Yeah,
some
that'd be
sometime.
super cool.
Awesome, man.
Yeah.
Very cool. Great. Very cool. All right, I'm going to remind you guys. So next week, we're back again with Kevin Dietrich, owner of Pacific Cocktail Haven, PCH, and Kona Street Market, talking translating heritage into a cocktail. Let's get our man Wayne back. Wayne, thank you so much for the education.
My pleasure.
I wish everybody was as organized and thoughtful. I didn't even have to keep it going with too many questions. But it was an honor to have you on. I'm sure everybody loved the words of wisdom and the throwback into history.
Okay. Hashtag rum. Look at be on
Hey,
it.
boom, there you go. That's how those work.
Yeah. That's what I've been told. You got to order your hashtag, or otherwise you don't know how to use the internet.
Well played.
I may be old, but I got it. I got it nailed.
See Wade Curtis on TikTok later today, talking 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s rum. Fantastic. Well, enjoy the rest of your stay up in Maine. Hopefully, we'll catch you down in NOLA at some point, and maybe we can convince you to come out in person to one of these things one time.
That would be a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me.
All right.
Okay.
Great to see you
Take care,
guys.
everyone. Bye.
Cheers.